Welcome, dear friends, to a quiet corner of the forest where mice, hedgehogs, and squirrels share gentle days and little adventures. Pour yourself a warm cup of tea, settle in, and let's wander together into the cozy world of woodland tales. The garden at Willow Bend. Morning at Willow Bend was quiet, save for the sound of dew dripping from the leaves into the grass below. The air carried the crisp scent of river water, mixed with the earthy fragrance of moss that clung to the trunks of old willows leaning out over the bank. Near the edge of the river stood a small cottage, cozy and round, with a door painted blue and a thatched roof so soft with moss it almost looked like it had grown out of the ground itself. Inside the cottage lived Bramwell, a thoughtful field mouse with whiskers that always twitched when he was deep in thought. Bramwell loved nothing more than tending his garden. Rows of beans, cabbages, herbs, and a scatter of wildflowers that seemed to plant themselves wherever they pleased. He often said that the soil around Willow Bend had a mind of its own, and sometimes he wasn't entirely joking. On this particular morning, Bramwell shuffled outside, carrying a little wooden tray of seedlings. His paws, still dusted with flour from breakfast, carefully pressed the tray onto the ground. But before he could set them in their proper row, something odd caught his eye. Right there, in the middle of the neat bean patch, was a plant that Bramwell had certainly not planted. Its leaves were broad and glossy, far different from the beans. In fact, the little sprout shimmered faintly when the sunlight struck it, a faint green glow as though the veins of the leaves were carrying some secret light. Bramwell crouched low, whiskers twitching, and tapped the soil around the sprout. Firm roots settled deep, not some stray seed blown in by the wind. Bramwell muttered, "You're no bean, and you're no cabbage either. What are you then?" Just then, footsteps squelched through the damp grass. Bramwell looked up to see his neighbor, Pipwick, a cheerful water vole who lived further down the bend. Pipwick carried a wicker basket and wore a wide grin. "Morning, Bramwell," Pipwick called. "I brought you a loaf from yesterday's bake. You'll have to forgive the crust. It's a touch tougher than I like." Bramwell smiled, but quickly gestured Pipwick over. "Come look at this. Tell me if you've ever seen the like." Pipwick leaned over the patch, his round face squinting. "Well, I'll be. That's no bean." He tapped the leaf and drew his paw back quickly. Did it just buzz? The two crouched in silence. For a moment, the little sprout seemed still. Then, a faint hum rose from the soil, as though the plant were softly singing to itself. "Buzzing beans!" Pipwick exclaimed, his whiskers twitching. "What are you growing out here, Bramwell?" "I didn't grow it," Bramwell insisted. "It just appeared." The two sat back, staring at the strange sprout, while the hum faded back into silence. The air seemed unchanged, the river still rolling gently nearby. Yet Bramwell couldn't shake the sense that something important had begun. "Perhaps it's just a wildflower," Pipwick said at last, though his tone lacked conviction. "Perhaps," Bramwell replied, "but I think we'll have to keep an eye on it." And so they did. The next few days at Willow Bend unfolded with a sense of anticipation, though to anyone passing by, things would have looked quite ordinary. Bramwell rose at dawn as he always did, tidied his cottage, and spent long mornings in the garden. But every day, before touching a hoe or watering can, his eyes flicked immediately to the strange little sprout. It was growing faster than any plant he had ever tended. Within a week, its stem was thick as his thumb, its leaves broad enough for a beetle to use as an umbrella. And though it made no sound during the day, Bramwell noticed that at dusk, when the first fireflies began to drift through the meadow, the plant let out a low, resonant hum that seemed to ripple in the soil itself. He hadn't told many about it, just Pipwick, who stopped by every evening now, carrying some excuse of a pie or a loaf, but always angling to peek at the humming plant. "It's growing into a song," Pipwick whispered one night as they watched its leaves glow faintly under moonlight. "Mark my words, that's no ordinary sprout. One morning, Bramble discovered he was not the only one watching. He had bent down to pull weeds from the carrot patch when a faint rustle came from the hedgerow. He straightened, ears perked, eyes narrowing. Between the brambles, he caught sight of movement. Two pairs of bright eyes, blinking curiously. "Who's there?" Bramble asked, not unkindly. Out shuffled two small hedgehogs, twins by the look of them, with quills sticking out in all directions and paws muddy from some earlier digging. "We saw it," said the first hedgehog, a little bolder than the other. "We saw your plant. It hums," the second added softly, his voice almost a whisper. Bramble brushed the dirt from his paws and tried not to look too suspicious. "Lots of plants hum, if you listen closely," he said. The hedgehogs shook their heads in unison. "Not like this one." Before Bramble could reply, Pipwick arrived with his basket swinging. When he noticed the hedgehogs, he gave a warm smile. "Ah, the Bramble twins. Come to sticky your paws in Bramble's cabbages, have you?" The twins shook their heads quickly, quills bristling. No, we came to see." Their voices carried such innocent awe that Bramble's suspicion softened. He crouched beside them, pointing toward the bean patch where the sprout now stretched nearly to his chest. "There it is. Strange, isn't it?" The twins crept closer. The plant did not hum this time, but its leaves shifted slightly as if stirred by an unseen breeze. One of the hedgehogs, braver now, reached out and brushed a paw over the surface of a leaf. For a heartbeat, the entire patch shimmered green. The air smelled suddenly of rain, though the sky was clear. And it was gone. The hedgehog squeaked and stumbled back. Bramble and Pipwick exchanged a glance. "We'll keep this quiet," the first hedgehog whispered, clutching his brother's paw. "But we'll be back." They scurried off toward the hedgerow, leaving Bramble staring after them. His heart thudded a little faster than he liked. Pipwick cleared his throat. "It's one thing for us to puzzle at it, Bramble. But if the young ones are taking notice, then it won't stay secret for long," Bramble finished. He gazed at the humming sprout, now too large to be ignored. "We'd best be ready for questions." That evening, as the twilight fell and the hum rose once more, Bramble sat on the cottage step, paws folded. He realized for the first time that the sound of the plant reminded him of something, distantly, faintly, like the lullabies his mother had sung when he was small. And though he could not explain why, that thought filled him with both comfort and worry. By the third week, Bramble's sprout was no longer a sprout. It was a towering stalk, curling upward with thick leaves that swayed even on still days. The neighbors had begun to murmur. Mrs. Hazel, the squirrel who lived 2 cottages down, asked bluntly at the riverbank one morning, "What's that thing in your patch, Bramble? Looks like it's trying to grow into the clouds." He brushed her off with vague talk of experimental beans, but he knew her sharp eyes had caught the shimmer in its leaves. Later that day, Pipwick suggested they take a closer look at its roots. "If it's feeding off your soil, maybe we'll see what it's really made of," he reasoned. So they knelt with trowels, digging carefully near the base of the stalk. But no sooner had Bramble turned over a spade of dirt than he froze. The roots were unlike any he'd seen. Instead of fibrous strands, these roots glowed faintly, like threads of moonlight, weaving deep into the soil. Worse, they seemed to pulse gently, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Pipwick sat back, fur on end. "That's not natural," he whispered. Bramble covered the roots again quickly, pressing soil firm. His whiskers twitched with unease. Then perhaps it's best not to meddle further. That night, unable to sleep, Bramble walked down to the river. The water flowed dark and smooth, the moon shimmering on its surface. He sat at the edge, paws dangling in the cool current, and let his thoughts drift. The hum of the plant carried faintly even here, mingling with the gurgle of the stream. Bramble tilted his head. Was it answering the river? He leaned closer, ears pricked. The current rushed around a fallen branch. making a low murmur that rose and fell in rhythm with the plant's hum. The sounds twined together like two voices in conversation. Brammel's fur prickled. He whispered aloud, as though the water might answer. "What are you?" A fish leapt, splashing silver spray across his paws. He laughed nervously, shaking off the droplets. But deep down, he couldn't shake the sense that the river had indeed whispered back, though in a language he did not yet understand. The next morning, Pipwick found him still sitting on the bank, eyes fixed on the horizon where mist curled above the reeds. "You'll wear yourself thin," Pipwick warned. "If this plant's weaving itself into your dreams, maybe you should cut it down before it gets the better of you." Brammel shook his head. "No, it's not harming anything. Not yet. But I think it belongs here. The river seems to think so too." Pipwick frowned, but said nothing. He respected Brammel's instincts, even when they seemed tangled in mystery. Still, as the two walked back toward the cottage, neither noticed the pair of hedgehog twins peering from the hedgerow once more, eyes wide, ears straining, listening to the hum of the plant as if it were telling them a story only they could hear. By midsummer, there was no hiding the plant. Its stalk rose taller than the cottage roof, its leaves spreading wide enough to shade half the garden. Neighbors slowed their steps whenever they passed by Willow Bend, staring openly. Some shook their heads, muttering about unnatural growth. Others whispered more fancifully, wondering if Brammel had stumbled upon some enchanted seed. For his part, Brammel carried on as best he could, though his days were now filled with interruptions. The Bramble twins came daily to sit cross-legged in front of the stalk, listening intently. A family of robins nested on one of its upper leaves, chirping merrily as if it were the most ordinary tree in the world. Even shy Mrs. Hazel dropped by often, pretending to borrow sugar, but always glancing nervously at the glowing leaves. Pipwick grew uneasy. The more they see it, the more stories they'll spin. One day, someone's bound to call it trouble. Brammel nodded. "I know, but I can't explain it to them any more than I can explain it to myself." The truth was, Brammel felt oddly protective of the plant. He had watched it grow, tended the soil around it, shielded it from late frosts. It felt less like a curiosity now and more like a guest, one who had come uninvited, but whose presence had reshaped the rhythm of life at Willow Bend. One evening, while Brammel prepared tea inside, Pipwick sat outside watching the last rays of sunlight fall across the stalk. He thought he heard something in the hum, a phrase almost like words. His whiskers twitched, but before he could lean closer, the Bramble twins piped up. "It's saying thank you," one whispered. "No, it's saying wait," said the other. Pipwick frowned. "What do you mean?" The twins looked at him solemnly, eyes reflecting the glow of the leaves. "It's waiting for something, or someone." Before Pipwick could press them, Brammel stepped out with a tray of steaming cups. The conversation ended, but the words lingered like smoke in the air. That night, Brammel dreamed of roots spreading deep under the earth, twining with the river, pulsing like veins. He dreamed of branches stretching high, leaves unfolding, carrying whispers into the wind. And when he awoke, the first thing he heard was the hum, steady, patient, waiting. By midsummer, Willow Bend had become busier than Brammel had seen in years. The towering beanstalk, while unusual, was no longer glowing or humming. It was simply there, a plant among plants, though larger than most. Neighbors had grown used to the sight, and, once their first curiosity passed, they seemed more interested in Brammel's company than in speculating about the stalk. One bright morning, Mrs. Hazel arrived at the gate carrying a basket of dried herbs. "For your pantry," she explained, setting it down on Brammel's step. "I had more than I needed." Pipwick, who happened to be perched on the fence with his nose buried in a book, chuckled. "You'll never starve with Mrs. Hazel nearby. She's the forest's most generous hoarder." Mrs. Hazel gave a polite sniff, but her eyes twinkled. Better to have too much than too little. Not long after, the Bramble twins trotted up, paws stained with berry juice. They offered Bramble a handful of blackberries, squashed and sticky, but clearly gathered with pride. Bramble took them with genuine gratitude, rinsed them in a pail of water, and added them to a bowl of cream. Soon, everyone was seated around the small garden table, spoons in paw, sharing the sweet tart treat. It became a habit. Neighbors passed by more often, bringing odds and ends, carrots, rolls of bread, scraps of cloth, even stories from further down the lane. Willow Bend, once a quiet corner of the meadow, was alive with chatter and laughter. Bramble found he didn't mind. Though he was a private creature by nature, there was something satisfying about seeing his garden table crowded with friends, each nibbling, sipping, and sharing the day's tales. One afternoon, Pipwick suggested they all take a trip to the market across the river. "You've too much rhubarb and no place to sell it," he told Bramble. "And besides, it'll do us good to stretch our paws somewhere new." So they packed a handcart with rhubarb, lettuces, and jars of Bramble's honey. The Bramble twins tagged along, insisting they could help by pulling weeds from the cracks in the cobblestones, though they spent most of the journey darting about, chasing dragonflies. The market was bustling. Stalls of apples, cheeses, flowers, and handmade tools stretched along the square. Musicians played fiddles while children wove between the legs of grown folk. Bramble felt slightly overwhelmed by the noise, but Pipwick dove straight in, haggling cheerfully with anyone who would listen. By midday, they had sold nearly everything from the cart. In exchange, Bramble had traded for oatcakes, a new watering can, and a warm wool scarf dyed with walnut husks. He returned home lighter in supplies, but heavier in spirits. That evening, as the group gathered around his table once more, Bramble realized how satisfying it felt to see his hard work turned into goods others valued. It wasn't just a garden anymore. It was part of the community's rhythm. A week later, rain fell steadily, soaking the meadow and drumming gently on the roof of Willow Bend. The garden glistened, each leaf beaded with silver droplets. The beanstalk, taller than ever, swayed peacefully in the downpour. Inside, Bramble had gathered his neighbors. A fire crackled in the hearth while the scent of tea and cinnamon filled the room. Mrs. Hazel knitted by the window. Pipwick sprawled on the rug, read aloud from an adventure story, changing his voice for each character to make the twins giggle. At one point, the littler hedgehog curled against Bramble's side, yawning widely. "It's warm here," he murmured sleepily. Bramble smiled, adjusting the blanket around the twins. "That's what homes are for." The rain tapped steadily against the panes. Outside, the meadow was quiet and gray, but inside the cottage was golden, full of warmth and laughter. By the time the fire burned low, the hedgehogs were asleep. Mrs. Hazel had finished another pair of mittens, and Pipwick was dozing mid-sentence with the book slipping from his paws. Bramble tucked blankets around each of them, his heart fuller than he could quite say. He paused at the window, looking out at his garden glistening under the rain. Life at Willow Bend was no longer just about tending soil and pulling weeds. It was about sharing food, stories, shelter, and he realized with a quiet certainty that he wouldn't have it any other way. The morning mist hung low over Willow Bend, blurring the edges of the meadow and softening every sound. Bramble padded outside with a steaming mug of nettle tea, his whiskers twitching as he surveyed the garden. The dew sparkled like tiny lanterns on every blade of grass, and somewhere in the hedgerow a thrush was practicing a tune that rose and fell like laughter. The beanstalk still reached toward the sky, its leaves unfurling fresh green with each passing week, but Bramble's eyes were mostly on the smaller, humbler things. The row of carrots he had planted too close together, the cheerful marigolds he had tucked between the lettuce, the little puddle where the twins had made a habit of splashing their paws. He bent down to tug at a weed, muttering to himself, when the familiar creak of the garden gate announced company. Pipwick arrived, clutching a roll of paper so long it nearly tripped him. "Bramwell!" he exclaimed, nearly stumbling into the rhubarb. "You'll never guess what I've been working on." Bramwell sighed in good humor. "Another scheme?" "Not a scheme, a plan," Pipwick corrected, unfurling the paper to reveal a sprawling map of the meadow. Tiny sketches of trees, paths, and even Bramwell's own cottage dotted the parchment. I thought, why not mark down where everything grows? Then, when the seasons change, we'll know just when the berries ripen or when Mrs. Hazel's mint is strongest. Bramwell studied the careful lines. For all of Pipwick's bluster, the map was tidy, detailed, and oddly comforting. "It's thoughtful," Bramwell admitted. Just then, the Bramble twins burst from the hedge, squealing with delight as they raced toward the puddle. "Mornin', Bramwell!" they cried in unison before throwing themselves into the shallow water with a splash. Mrs. Hazel followed more sedately, a basket looped over her arm. "I see the twins found your puddle again," she remarked. "I brought radish tops for your compost, if you've room." By the time the sun burned off the mist, Bramwell's garden had filled with the gentle bustle of friends. Pipwick comparing notes on his map with Mrs. Hazel, the twins daring each other to leap higher in the puddle. Bramwell himself quietly weeding while keeping half an ear on the chatter. It was ordinary, yes, but in its ordinariness lay a kind of peace Bramwell had never thought to seek. Later that week, Bramwell found himself staring at a cracked roof tile. Rain was due again soon, and he couldn't risk a leak soaking his pantry shelves. He considered climbing up himself, but the thought of balancing on the sloped roof with his short legs made him grimace. Instead, he fetched a basket and set out for the lane that wound through the meadow. "The tinker should have something," he muttered. The lane was lively that afternoon. A family of squirrels hurried by with bundles of acorns. A frog carried a small crate balanced on his head, and further ahead, a mole ambled along, his paws stained with soil. Everyone greeted Bramwell warmly, offering nods or brief words before continuing about their business. At the tinker's cart, Bramwell found just what he needed: a stack of clay tiles and a pot of pitch. He chose carefully, tested the weight, and exchanged a jar of honey for the goods. The tinker, a cheerful badger with spectacles perched on his nose, threw in a packet of nails besides. On the way back, Bramwell paused at the riverbank where Pipwick sat sketching. "Go to fix your roof?" Pipwick guessed, tapping his pencil against the page. "That's the plan," Bramwell replied, "though I might ask for help. Ladders don't suit hedgehogs." True to form, Pipwick insisted on coming along, and by the time they returned to Willow Bend, Mrs. Hazel and the twins had appeared as well. "Roof work, is it?" Hazel asked, rolling up her sleeves. "Then we'll all lend a paw." What might have been a lonely and tiresome chore turned into a merry affair. Pipwick scurried up the ladder with surprising agility, calling down for tools. Mrs. Hazel measured and cut the pitch with precision. The twins carried tiles two at a time, their paws wobbling under the weight, but their spirits high. By evening, the roof was sound again, patched neatly and sealed against the coming rain. They gathered around the hearth and sighed, sipping elderflower cordial Bramwell had set aside for just such a gathering. As laughter filled the cottage, Bramwell realized the errand had been only half the story. The other half was this: neighbors arriving unasked but welcome, transforming a chore into a memory. The storm came at last, heavy and determined. Rain lashed the roof, but thanks to their work, no leaks dripped onto Bramwell shelves. He sat in the window seat with a blanket around his shoulders, listening to the steady rhythm of water on the tiles. Outside, the garden bent and shimmered under the downpour. The beanstalk swayed but held firm. Birds huddled in the hedges, wings puffed. By midday, visitors had arrived despite the weather. Pipwick knocked first, dripping wet and shaking out his fur. "Couldn't stand another minute alone with my books," he confessed, though Bramble suspected he simply enjoyed Bramble's tea. Mrs. Hazel followed soon after, clutching a basket of warm scones wrapped in cloth. "Better eaten together," she insisted. The Bramble twins came last, tracking muddy paw prints but grinning from ear to ear. The little cottage grew warm and fragrant as the fire blazed and tea brewed. The twins built towers of firewood beside the hearth. Pipwick read another story aloud, his voice rising dramatically over the storm. Hazel clicked her needles, the steady sound as comforting as the rain. As Bramble poured tea into each cup, he paused to take in the sight. Friends gathered close, the windows glowing against the gray. The storm shut firmly outside. The rain would pass, as all storms did. What lingered was this sense of belonging, this quiet certainty that however ordinary their days might seem, they were stitched together by small acts of kindness, by tea shared, by roofs mended, by laughter echoing off cottage walls. And Bramble, once so certain he preferred solitude, found himself hoping the cottage would always be this full. The morning after the storm broke clear and bright, as if the forest itself had been scrubbed clean. Droplets clung to every branch, winking like gems in the sunlight. The river ran quicker than usual, frothing white where it met hidden stones, its banks dark with fresh mud. Bramble the mouse woke earlier than he intended, for the light spilled uncommonly sharp through a small round window, and the sound of the river seemed to echo more loudly than on ordinary mornings. He stretched, tucked the quilt neatly at the foot of the bed. He could not abide a rumpled quilt, and padded down the wooden steps to the kitchen. The stove still smelled faintly of last night's fire. He kindled it again, listening as the flame caught with a comforting whoosh, then set about slicing a loaf of Pipwick's bread to toast. As the bread crisped, Bramble opened the back door to let in the morning air. At once, the scent of wet earth and crushed leaves drifted in, sharp and wholesome. The garden lay glittering in the sun, and though the storm had bent some stems and plastered leaves with mud, the beanstalk still stood strong, its leaves trembling proudly in the light breeze. Breakfast was a quiet affair, toast with honey, nettle tea, and a single radish sliced thin, because Bramble believed meals ought to be balanced even when simple. As he ate, he thought of the chores ahead. The carrot patch would need tidying, the compost turning, the rain barrel checked. Yet there was no rush. The air was fresh and the day long. He was still licking the last of the honey from his whiskers when the garden gate creaked. Pipwick appeared, his fur sticking out at all angles, his paws already muddy. "Bramble, you must come down to the riverbank," he cried, breathless with excitement. "There's driftwood everywhere." The storm carried half the forest downstream. Bramble hesitated. He had planned for a quiet morning. But curiosity tugged at him, and besides, Pipwick's enthusiasm was difficult to refuse. "Very well," he said at last, dusting crumbs from his paws. "Let's have a look." The two set off along the narrow path that wound from Bramble's garden to the river. Birds flitted from branch to branch above them, calling to one another as though eager to discuss the storm. Mushrooms had sprung up overnight, pale buttons pushing through the damp soil, and once Bramble paused to watch a snail make its slow way across a fallen leaf. At the riverbank, Pipwick's words proved true. The current had carried down branches, bark, and even an uprooted sapling, now wedged against a boulder midstream. Piles of twigs littered the shore. "It's like a carpenter's yard," Pipwick exclaimed. "Imagine what we could build. New shelves, perches for the garden, maybe even a little bench." Bramble bent to examine a length of wood polished smooth by the water. He traced the grain with his paw, imagining it as a sturdy handle for a spade or a peg for hanging coats. "Useful, certainly," he agreed, "though I'd not call it carpenter's yard. More like nature's leftovers." Together they began to gather the driest pieces, stacking them neatly by the path. Pipwick, ever restless, darted here and there, pointing out interesting knots or shapes, while Bramble worked more slowly, inspecting each piece for soundness. They had collected a fair bundle when voices carried across the meadow. Mrs. Hazel was approaching with the Bramble twins in tow, the little ones bouncing with energy after a morning cooped up by rain. "Mind if we join?" Hazel called. "Of course not," Bramble replied, though he suspected his neat piles would not last long under the twins' eager paws. Indeed, within minutes they were clambering over the driftwood, pretending it was a shipwreck, squealing about pirates and treasure. Hazel merely shook her head, settling herself on a smooth stone to watch them. The sun climbed higher, warming their fur and drying the mud. The river's roar softened as they grew used to it, becoming a steady accompaniment to their work and play. By noon, their driftwood bundles were respectable, the twins happily exhausted, and Hazel had gathered a pocketful of glossy pebbles to decorate her hearth. They sat in the grass to share lunch. Hazel had brought oat biscuits, Pipwick offered slices of apple, and Bramble contributed a wedge of hard cheese he had tucked into his satchel. It was nothing fancy, but eaten under the wide sky with the smell of river water in their noses, it tasted finer than any feast. Afterward, they made their way back to Bramble's cottage, each carrying some small treasure from the riverbank. The twins dragged sticks nearly twice their size. Pipwick cradled a long branch as if it were a precious find, and Bramble bore a neat stack balanced carefully in his arms. By the time they reached the garden, the afternoon light slanted golden across the fields. The chores could wait. The driftwood could be stacked for another day. For now, Bramble felt content simply to sit on his doorstep, paws wrapped around a mug of tea, watching his friends chatter and laugh as the shadows lengthened across Willow Bend. The morning after their expedition to the riverbank dawned bright but cool, with a sharpness in the air that hinted of the season turning. A mist still clung to the lowest parts of the meadow, and Bramble could see it drifting like soft smoke between the stalks of tall grass. He rose early, as was his custom, and went about opening the shutters of his round windows one by one. The cottage filled with pale light, slanting through the beams and catching on the polished wood of his table. Breakfast was a slow affair, porridge sweetened with a drizzle of last year's blackberry jam and a mug of steaming peppermint tea. Bramble ate thoughtfully, his mind turning over the problem that had nagged him since yesterday. The driftwood bundles were piled neatly by the garden wall. Yes, but his tool shed was already full to bursting. If he didn't clear some space, he'd have nowhere to store the new finds. So, after washing up his bowl, he donned his stoutest apron, pulled open the shed door, and peered inside. The sight made him sigh aloud. The shed was small, built snug against the cottage with a mossy roof and a door that sagged a little on its hinges. Inside, shelves bowed under the weight of jars, some neatly labeled, others entirely forgotten. A spade leaned precariously against a broken stool, while baskets and bundles of twine sprawled every which way. "I'll never fit so much as a twig in here," Bramble muttered. He rolled up his sleeves. Best make a day of it. It was not long before Pipwick appeared at the gate, waving cheerily. "Tidying, are you? I thought I'd hear the clatter of tools. Do you need a paw?" Bramble hesitated. Pipwick's help was well meant, but he had a tendency to become distracted by useful discoveries. Still, 2 paws were better than 1. "Come along then," Bramble said, stepping aside. The work began with pulling everything out into the yard. Soon the garden looked as though a small market had sprung up. There were baskets filled with rusty nails, a stack of tiles left over from the roof repair, a jumble of bent spoons, and bundles of string in every imaginable thickness. Pipwick rummaged gleefully, producing treasures. "Look at this hook. Could be just a thing for hanging lanterns. And this jar, perfect for keeping buttons." Bramble tried to keep order, sorting items into piles. Keep, mend, and give away. He labeled each with scraps of paper tied on with twine. It was steady, satisfying work, though the sun climbed higher and sweat began to prickle his brow. By mid-morning, Mrs. Hazel arrived with the twins. "I saw your garden from the lane," she called. "Thought you'd open a shop." "It feels like it," Bramble admitted. "But no, only the shed." Hazel set down a basket of gooseberries. "The twins can help sort string from straw, if you don't mind. They've too much energy today." And so the task grew livelier. The twins raced to find matching jars, stacked baskets into wobbly towers, and argued cheerfully over who was strongest at carrying spades. Hazel herself took to mending handles with twine, her clever paws making quick work of splits and cracks. By midday, the piles had taken shape. The shed, swept clean and lined with fresh straw, looked almost twice its size. Bramble carefully stacked driftwood in the corner, hung tools on newly hammered pegs, and set the labeled jars in neat rows along the shelf. At last he stepped back, whiskers twitching with satisfaction. There now, order restored. Hazel clapped her paws. "It's the tittiest shed in Willow Bend." The twins, sprawled in the grass and sticky with gooseberry juice, chorused, "Can we do it again tomorrow?" "Not if I can help it," Bramble replied, though his smile softened the words. They ended the day with gooseberries and honey biscuits shared on the doorstep, the shed standing proud and neat behind them. The next day was clear and golden, the kind of late summer day that begged for wandering. Pipwick appeared at Bramble's gate with his enormous roll of parchment tucked under one arm. "I've made progress," he cried. "Come see." They spread the parchment on Bramble's table. Where before only a sketch of the meadow and garden had appeared, now the riverbank, the willow copse, and even the tinker's cart were carefully drawn. Pipwick had marked berry bushes with neat little circles, beehives with hexagons, and mushroom rings with dotted lines. "It's impressive," Bramble admitted, "but I don't see the shed." "The shed?" Pipwick tapped the parchment. "Oh yes, here it is, though it looked so cluttered yesterday, I hardly dared to draw it. Now that it's tidy, I'll update it." Bramble chuckled. "You'll run out of parchment before you run out of places. That's why I brought another sheet." Pipwick unfurled a fresh roll, nearly knocking his mug of tea into his lap. Before long, Hazel arrived, curiosity piqued, and soon the twins clambered onto chairs to point out their favorite spots. "You forgot the puddle," one insisted. "And the log where the beetles live," added the other. Hazel, ever practical, suggested marking the seasons as well. When the blackberries ripen, when the mushrooms sprout. Then the map will be useful year-round. And so the day became one of charting. They took turns strolling to nearby landmarks, measuring distances with careful steps, returning to mark them on the parchment. Pipwick sketched with tongue between his teeth. Bramble checked his neat rows. Hazel offered advice, and the twins made elaborate doodles of imaginary castles in the corners. By evening, the map had grown into something remarkable, not merely lines and symbols, but a living portrait of their shared world. They pinned it to Bramble's wall, promising to add more as time passed. Bramble regarded it with quiet pride. "It makes our little bend of the river seem whole," he murmured, "as though we belonged to it, and it to us." That night, after his friends had gone, Bramble settled into his favorite chair by the hearth. The day's bustle had left him pleasantly tired, and the crackle of the fire soothed his ears. On the wall, Pipwick's map caught the glow of the flames. The inked lines softened into shadow and gold. He thought of the shed, now neat and ordered, and of the driftwood stacked ready for some future project. He thought of the twins' laughter, of Hazel's steady pause, of Pipwick's ceaseless enthusiasm. And he thought of the beanstalk in the garden, quietly growing under the starlit sky. Outside, an owl hooted. The river murmured its endless tune. Bramble drew the quilt tighter about his shoulders and let his eyes drift shut. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new small adventures, perhaps another errand or an unexpected visit. Nothing grand, nothing dramatic, just the steady rhythm of life at Willow Bend. And that, Bramwell thought drowsily, was adventure enough. Saturday morning came with the sound of bells ringing faintly across the meadow. Market day. Even from his cottage window, Bramwell could see faint wisps of smoke rising above the village square, where stalls were being set up, each draped in cheerful awnings of striped cloth. Market day was always both a delight and a small ordeal. Bramwell loved the bustle, the sense of fresh bread, herbs, and roasted nuts, the way neighbors greeted one another, the music that always seemed to spring from someone's fiddle. But he also knew it meant crowds, jostling, and the need to keep his whiskers tucked politely away while more excitable creatures darted about. Still, he had promised himself he'd go. He'd jars of honey to trade, and Hazel had asked him to bring back thread if the weaver had any left. So he packed carefully, 2 jars of honey wrapped in cloth, a small basket of walnuts polished until their shells gleamed, and a pouch of dried chamomile flowers tied with a neat string. He fastened the strap over his shoulder, pulled his cloak tight against the morning breeze, and set out along the lane. The walk to the village was pleasant. The hedgerows were thick with late summer berries, black and shining. Sparrows flitted above him, and once he startled a hedgehog crossing the path with a snail clasped proudly in its jaws. The air was cool but bright, carrying the mixed scents of damp earth and fresh-cut hay. By the time Bramwell reached the square, it was in full swing. Stalls lined the cobbled circle, their owners calling out greetings and bargains. The baker, Mrs. Rowan, had loaves stacked in golden pyramids, their crusts glistening. The tinker displayed pots and pans polished to a mirror shine. Children ran underfoot with ribbons trailing, while Fiddler played a sprightly tune near the fountain. "Bramwell!" cried Pipwick, who was of course already there, bouncing from stall to stall with a pouch far too large for his size. "Look, plums, and ribbon, and, oh, you must try the roasted chestnuts." Bramwell managed a smile, though he kept his grip on his basket firm as Pipwick tugged him toward a vendor. One thing at a time, Pipwick. Ive erans todo. They began with the weaver, who thankfully had a roll of pale green thread. For Hazel, Bramwell explained as he tucked it carefully into his pouch. Then they bartered with the potter for a small mug, smooth and brown, perfect for winter cocoa. The honey was eagerly taken by the baker in exchange for 2 loaves of rye and a pouch of currant buns. All the while, Bramwell greeted neighbors. Mrs. Brindle with her gooseberries, young Alder selling willow baskets, old Mr. Thatch still trying to pawn off his endless supply of turnips. He paused for a steaming paper cone of roasted chestnuts, which he shared with Pipwick as they strolled between the stalls. By midday, the square was a whirl of sound and color. Hazel arrived with the twins, each dragging a basket nearly bigger than themselves. They darted to the sweet stall immediately, but Hazel intercepted them with a sharp look and a firm paw. She exchanged warm greetings with Bramwell and pressed a small cloth-wrapped parcel into his paw. "Cheese," she whispered, "from the dairy. You'll need it for your bread." The afternoon drifted by in a haze of chatter, music, and trade. By the time Bramwell began the walk home, his basket was heavier, his cloak pockets bulging with odds and ends. The square behind him still rang with fiddles and laughter, but he was glad to slip into the quieter lane again. When at last he reached his cottage, he set his purchases neatly on the table. Bread, cheese, thread, the new mug, and a tiny posy of late marigolds given to him by the flower seller. He brewed himself a cup of tea, buttered a thick slice of bread, and ate slowly while the meadow quieted into evening. Market day had been busy, but his cottage felt all the warmer for it, filled with good things and good memories. The next morning dawned gray. Clouds pressed low over the meadow, heavy and slow-moving, and by mid-morning the rain began. At first it was a soft patter, then a steady curtain of water that blurred the hedgerows into shifting shadows. Bramwell welcomed it. He had no errands pressing, no visitors expected. Rainy days were for staying indoors for simple tasks that soothed the paws and quieted the mind. He lit a fire, laid out his knitting, a scarf in shades of mossy green, and filled the kettle. The steady rhythm of rain against the windows made a gentle accompaniment, but quiet rarely lasted long in Willow Bend. A knock rattled the door. Bramwell opened it to find Pipwick, dripping wet, a bedraggled cloak clinging to a small frame. "It's dreadful out there," Pipwick announced, stomping inside without waiting. "My roof sprung a leak right above my bed, and I thought perhaps you might have a bit of tar, or a board, or something useful." Bramwell sighed, ushering him closer to the fire. "You'll catch your death running about in weather like this. Sit down, dry off. We'll think." Pipwick obeyed, though restlessly, hopping from chair to hearthrug to window. Bramwell brewed strong tea and placed it in his paws. Together, they considered the problem. The shed, tidied only 2 days ago, held boards and nails aplenty, but neither of them fancied climbing onto a roof in such rain. Hazel arrived soon after, shawl pulled tight, carrying a bundle of mending. "I heard Pipwick shouting halfway down the lane," she explained. She examined his plight with calm eyes. "Best wait till the rain stops. For now, you can sleep by the fire here, or I'll put up a cot for you at my house." Pipwick looked torn. His pride resisted charity, but the lure of warmth was too great. "Here," he muttered, "if Bramwell doesn't mind." So the day passed with the three of them tucked into the cottage. Hazel mended socks and mittens. Bramwell added several inches to his scarf, and Pipwick, once fed and warmed, busied himself sketching plans for improved roof drainage. Outside, the rain drummed steady and strong, turning paths into streams and fields into silver sheets. By evening, the rain softened. Pipwick dozed by the hearth. Hazel hummed softly as she folded her mending, and Bramwell set out bowls of steaming soup, carrot, potato, and leek, with thick slices of rye bread from the market. They ate slowly, grateful for warmth and companionship. When Pipwick finally curled under a quilt in Bramwell's armchair, Hazel whispered, "It's good we have one another, isn't it?" Bramwell nodded, gazing into the fire. Outside, the meadow shimmered under the last threads of rain, but inside all was steady and bright. The rain cleared by the next morning, leaving the meadow shining and sweet-smelling. And it was just in time. For that evening, the village celebrated the harvest feast. The feast was the crown of the year, held in the great barn near the square. Everyone brought a dish, and everyone, from the smallest mouse to the oldest badger, gathered to share. Lanterns were strung in garlands. Tables groaned under pies and puddings, and music filled every corner. Bramwell prepared carefully. He baked a honey cake, its golden crust brushed with syrup until it gleamed. Hazel contributed jars of spiced apple butter. The twins proudly carried baskets of roasted chestnuts, and Pipwick, despite his leaky roof, managed to cobble together a pot of mushroom stew. By twilight, the barn was aglow with lantern light. Long tables ran the length of the room, covered in dishes, berry pies, roasted squash, nut loaves, bowls of stewed plums, trays of biscuits dusted with sugar. The smell was intoxicating. Neighbors crowded in with laughter and chatter. Bramwell found himself seated between Hazel and the fiddler, who insisted on telling outrageous tales between tunes. Pipwick darted from table to table, sampling everything and proclaiming each dish the best yet. The twins wove between chairs with ribbons in their fur, giggling. As the night wore on, the feast gave way to music. The fiddler struck up lively reels, others clapped paws or tapped spoons, and soon a circle of dancers whirled in the lantern light. Even Bramwell, who rarely danced, was coaxed into a slow, swaying round, Hazel steady on his arm. At last, when the moon was high and the barn grew quiet, Bramwell stepped outside. The field stretched dark and wide under the starlight, the air crisp with autumn promise. Behind him the barn still glowed, laughter and songs spilling faintly into the night. He breathed deeply, paws folded behind his back. Willow Bend was small, ordinary, and often slow, but nights like this, it seemed the richest place in the world. The end. Thank you for wandering through the woodland with us today. If you enjoyed your visit to Old Fernwood, don't forget to leave a like, share this tale with a friend, and subscribe for more cozy stories. Until next time, may your days be calm, your hearth warm, and your heart light.